Scientists, what is the one thing that you wish the general public had a better understanding of? Just because it's a paper, it doesn't mean it's credible. The idea behind peer-reviewed articles versus none, along with small sample size studies, are generally not a good representation of the entire population. Story 2. Antibiotics and antibiotic resistance. A lot of people are under the impression they're a magical pill that will cure a lot of symptoms or diseases, when they are only effective against a handful of bacterial infections, which means your common cold or flu are not treatable with them. So demanding your doctor to give you unnecessary antibiotics when you're sick is unhelpful and possibly even dangerous, as it may lead to increases in antibiotic resistance. This could make the most basic drugs we have completely useless, and return to a Victorian era of common infections leading to death. Story 3. I get a lot of heat when I say this here for some reason, but as an evolutionary biologist with a background in anthropology, I wish people understood that almost all of the behaviors we see in humans around us are due to cultural evolution and not biological evolution. Cultural evolution is so much faster than biological evolution that these traits we see never had time to develop biologically or to be hardwired in. Also, people far too often think that what they see in their culture around them is a universal. One thing I learned as an anthropologist is that for everything we find desirable or natural, another culture finds repulsive or taboo, or vice versa. People are always saying things like, "We do XYZ because back when we were cavemen, you needed to do it to survive being eaten by a tiger, get more mates, or some such." Story 4. A few things from a research chemist who dabbles in materials science and food science as well. 1. Just because someone is an expert or really educated in a certain topic doesn't mean they know everything about science. So just because someone has a PhD doesn't mean that they are a good resource on every subject that they speak about. This is really misrepresented in Hollywood, as they always show the brainiac scientist to engineer type that can defuse a bomb, hack a computer, identify wild plants, and perform complicated surgery, all in the span of a day. 2. From someone who currently works in a food science-related job, I wish people had a better grasp on the difference between truly dangerous, harmful, toxic chemicals and those that just sound scary because of their long names. There's so much chemophobia circulating around popular media, and it really encourages misinformation and anti-intellectualism. I really encourage people informing themselves by looking at food labels to know what they're ingesting, but I also encourage educating yourself on what those words really mean, instead of getting freaked out about big words on labels that describe ingredients that really are beneficial and protect people from worse things like food-borne illness. 3. There are rampant issues with ethics in science, both industry and academia, hiding mistakes, tweaking data to give better results, taking a measurement over and over again until you get something that looks like what you want, being pushed by management to release product that teeters on the edges of specification. It happens everywhere, and people would be shocked if they realized how prevalent it is. There's a lot more. Science is incredible, but it's done by human beings. And human beings make mistakes. Some days I love it, some days I hate it. It's really just a job like any other. Edit, diffuse, not diffuse. Story 5. Physics doesn't know why most things work. We just know that they do work, and we work backwards from what we observe. Also, just because we have small computers does not mean the rest of science is at Star Trek levels. Story 6. One that bugs me is that science, engineering. An astronomer does not build rockets. An aerospace engineer doesn't study expansion of the universe. Both are awesome, but they are fundamentally different. Story 7. Speaking from my little corner of the scientific community, I wish people understood DNA evidence better. DNA analysis is a fantastic tool. We can detect very minute amounts of DNA, so in some cases we could tell if you've even just touched something. In the past 20 years, the capabilities of analysis have just gotten better and better. You used to need enormous amounts of stain to produce a profile. This, of course, has led to DNA evidence being collected for more than just murder and rape, and that's fine. We're here to catch the perpetrators, though it does mean crime labs suffer backlogs as more and more evidence gets sent to us to test. The proliferation of the technology and its recent entrenchment in popular culture, however, has led to a courtroom expectation that it will be present in every case, and that there's some sort of failure of legitimacy if it isn't there. They really do call this the CSI effect, and while it affects the whole forensic community, nowhere is it worse than in DNA. What DNA can tell you, a profile that can be compared to a known standard and a probability of a match, can be assigned what DNA can't tell you. How that DNA got there, when that DNA got there, whether it's probative to the crime, whether it really means anything, whether it means someone is guilty or not. You need more than DNA evidence to convict, and merely having DNA evidence is not indicative of guilt. It needs to be considered as a whole case, not just one piece of evidence. Please, if you ever get placed on a jury, give your fellow man the proper consideration he's due and listen to the impartial experts. Yes, defense lawyers can hire experts to say whatever they want to, so be careful. Story 8. Not all science is good. Not everything published is worth reading or even close to being correct. Just like in most jobs, there are good scientists and bad scientists. There are good scientific publications and bad scientific publications. When a normal news site says their view is supported by science, it's most likely that they either A, misinterpreted a scientific article, or B, found a reference from a terrible journal that probably isn't even peer-reviewed. What most people don't know is that many universities in Asian Indian countries will pay you to publish, regardless of the quality of work. Students get anywhere from a few $100s per publication to a few $1,000s per publication. This results in people publishing shit just to get paid. It also results in people doing very little work, then writing 13 different papers, each very slightly different than the last. People also will form alliances so that they get their name on more papers. If you ever see a paper that has like 15-20 authors, this is likely the case. Everyone on that paper gets paid. So what you do is make deals with your buddies to put your name on all their papers, and vice versa. The amount of politics in science is absolutely stupid. At the top, sure, it's all good science. But at the bottom, just like with most things in life, the bottom feeders are messing everything up and making it worse for everyone else. The public thinks that if it was published, it must be true, when in fact that couldn't be further from the truth. If you said, if it was published in a reputable journal, then it must be true. That'd be closer to the truth, but still not 100% correct. Being a scientist means learning when to believe what you're reading and when to start asking the hard questions. The general public does not know that, and therefore believes almost every scientific-looking paper they come across. This makes good scientists look bad, because we constantly have to admit, well, really, that paper was published in a really bad journal that's not peer-reviewed, so you shouldn't believe it. To which the public asks, well then, why was it published? To which the answer is money. To which the public asks, well then, why is it still published? To which the answer is, no real scientist cares enough to police the shitty journals. We don't have the time. Story 9. That just because they hated math in middle school does not mean they cannot understand math, or math is bad. First of all, the math you learnt at middle and high school qualify as much as math, as spelling lessons qualify as literature. You were taught calculus and proof redaction. That's why your teacher refused proofs that were not his proofs. You weren't tested on maths. You were tested on proof redaction, which are useful, but probably the most boring part of math. Second, I will use an anecdote. Sometimes, video games need to do some huge and quick computation, and if they use the standard way of doing it, it will take way too long. However, it finds out that the most efficient part of your computer is the graphic card. So they hack the graphic card to make computation that had nothing to do with graphics. Math is something similar for humans. Humans are not naturally able to deal mathematical abstraction. However, the brain has the computation power to do so. You just have to train your brain to do it. That's why people that are good in math see the solution. They are literally using part of their brain that were not made for math in order to do math, so they can see it. As mental image, of course, I'm not saying they are hallucinating. And that's also why teaching math is difficult, because everybody's brain is different. So it is normal to fail at math if things are not explained on an adequate way for you. To understand them, you have to change the way you learn them until you find one that works for you. Story 10. We absolutely cannot use computer models to test drugs instead of animals. We cannot use binding assays to test drugs instead of animals. We cannot use cell lines to test drugs instead of animals. We absolutely do other methods before larger animal studies, and we have to justify the number of animals we use for everything. We cannot just use one kind of animal because no animal is enough like us for that to be sufficient. But I almost never say that to people because what they hear is, animal testing is useless. This goes for all kinds of scientific studies too. I understand all of this is said with good intentions by people who do not understand how complex even the simplest biological process actually is, or how little we know about it so far. Or by people who ideologically do not care if we advance medicine. Fine. People believe whatever they want, but maybe don't leave stupid comments about how we should test drugs on prisoners instead. Almost every time I see these comments, it's from people who eat meat who have discovered that some research involves cute animals. Story 11. How to read articles. Hear me out. There are lots of scientific journals out there today, but some of them can be affiliated with companies that wishes to have the study results concluded in their favor. Thus, this nullifies any results published due to company influence to skew the data and methodology. Some scientists are even being influenced to publish data that are skewed, causing false conclusions. Story 12. Be critical, A, skeptical, and don't just get drawn by some news or blog article saying, new study shows this. Chances are, the writer of the article isn't a content expert in that scientific topic and will be interpreting them in a way to increase views. Story 13. Certainty. Scientists are the type of person who do not like saying they're 100% certain of anything. We've been hurt too many times before, so if a scientist says, I'm 99.9% sure it will work, another scientist hears, this is worth betting on working. But we live in a universe where there's always a chance of failure. But a non-scientist hears, this isn't something that's absolutely proven, and therefore isn't always true. For example, there has never been a recorded instance of someone becoming infected with HIV while properly taking Truvada, to my knowledge. But still, any advertisement for it says that it has a 99.9% chance success rate, though the takeaway here isn't just to round up and consider a 99.900. The takeaway is to realize that it's very hard to be 100% certain about anything, and to understand that Story 14. I am an undergraduate researcher, which is several steps below a scientist. However, I have had the opportunity to learn a great deal about the nuclear power industry of late. Our society is completely ignoring a viable option to solve the entire energy crisis. Why? One word. Chernobyl. That story is really just an example of what happens when you hand control of a perfectly safe nuclear reactor over to a bunch of Kremlin experimentalist monkeys. They ignored all standard protocol and fucked everything up. Nuclear power, in the absence of idiots, is extremely stable and completely safe. There are 100 nuclear reactors, and they provide 20% of our power grid. That is an amazing fact. Our society is guzzling fossil fuels at a rate that the environment cannot possibly support, and rather than transition to a clean, safe alternative, we start fracking the shit out of our homeland. In 40 years, when nuclear power takes over by necessity, don't complain to me about gas prices for your stupid petrol-guzzling machines. Story 15. Neuroscience master degree student, but I'll give my 2 centavos on one. Not everything we see that work on cells, in vitro experiments, or in mice will work on humans. They can be serious leads, but lots of the time, it doesn't work well on primates, or don't work at all. 2. Animal experimentation is not for shit and giggle, and give us a really good amount of information. I don't like it, but I don't see how it can completely be avoided. We are not happy to do it, but we have to, and it's very very regulated. You don't just take some rats and be like, let's cut them open. You have an ethic committee. You have certification you need to have to practice them. There are procedures to respect. You need to use as few animals as possible. You need to ask for permission to the ethic committee. Ask why you will do such and such thing, what you want to prove, see, and explain how you cannot avoid the experimentation, and everything has to be as painless as possible for the animal models. Story 16. Applied scientist here. Engineer. Science is not a belief system. Attempting to dismiss something studied and supported using science by saying, well, I just believe something different. How can you expect me to respect your beliefs if you won't respect mine? Isn't valid. Further, science should never set out to prove something is true. It should only find out what is supported by evidence, even if it's contrary to your hypothesis, and possibly desires. Honestly, I wish more scientists respected this. Story 17. Statistics and data interpretation. Honestly, I don't give two shits if the general public knows about all the ins and outs of genetics or whatever, but people need to be able to interpret data relevant to themselves. Science should not be taught as a list of facts, but a system of reasoning and knowledge based on experimentation, observation, and data interpretation. Quick and similar addition. The idea of science as a way of describing what we observe as opposed to a hard doctrine on how we expect it to work. If something that breaks the laws of physics is observed, the laws change. You don't then consider that thing outside of science or whatever. Another addition, similar to things I already said. The phrase, science can't explain, and similar are meaningless. Science will explain it eventually, because that is what science is, finding and adapting explanations. And if our current models can't accept something, the models change. But it is slow, because it relies on rigor. Tal, dar. Science is a system of thought and not a doctrine. Scientific explanations change constantly but slowly because of this. Story 18. Astronomer here. I think people often assume that science is just a bunch of facts with no room for interpretation. The fact of the matter is, science is done by people, and even the best qualified people in the world will have their preferences and biases. The interpretation is not always easy. Sometimes your previous experience is actually not relevant to your current data set. And yes, sometimes you're just unconsciously less open to hearing results from scientist X because you don't get on with him. Scientists, like everyone, will also fall into the trap of assuming they are being objective when in fact relying on subjective opinions. Anyway, point is, science is hard, and we try our best, but remember, any human endeavor is subject to all the good and bad things about being a human. I think sometimes science geeks overlook that. Story 19. What science discussions are like between colleagues, including what conferences and peer review are like. I've seen a lot of comments where people seem to think scientists all just agree with each other because it's an echo chamber. But that's not what it's like at all. Scientists are nitpicky and love to try to tear each other's work to shreds. That's how we make the science better. It's not about just patting each other on the back. It's about exposing a work's weaknesses. Conferences are mostly fights, not praise, lol. So the reason people haven't dismantled a highly held view is not because scientists need an outside perspective. If there is an obvious weakness in someone's work, a scientist would have already pointed it out. Scientists love proving people wrong. Of course, sometimes scientists are wrong, and with big things. But that's just because the clues were all pointing in one direction, not because scientists refuse to look at other clues. Story 20. How statistics work, and how bullshit artists can massage data to say what they want. Case in point, the single, retracted, paper-linking vaccines to autism. That study had so many obvious problems with its data. It never would have made an impact on society if people understood how and why it was so flawed. Story 21. Does studying to become one scientist qualify? If so, I wish people had a better understanding for how to interpret news articles about scientific studies. I think that in today's time, we all know that you can't take science-y news articles at face value, yet we also don't know what to make of them instead. It's not like they have no informative value at all. You kinda have to develop a sense for how much are they hyping this up and subtracting that. Where does this place the significance and/or conclusiveness of the original study? Story 22. I'm an engineer, but my education is in physics. Murphy's Law. No, it's not. Whatever bad can happen will happen. That's just fucking stupid. It's under an infinite amount of circumstances, whatever is possible remains inevitable, meaning that once you approach infinity, statistical variables become assured events. In Interstellar, there's a scene where Murph says that she was named after the aforementioned quote. Then Matthew McConaughey was like, "That's not Murphy's Law." And I'm thinking, yes, spill the tea, sister. Then that walking Texas ambient drolls out, "Murphy's Law means whatever can happen will happen," completely ignoring what causes the thing to happen. My sergeants in the army use the Murphy's Law quote a lot. It pisses me off to no end. No, you're not smart for knowing the term Murphy's Law. No, it is not what you think. You're not impressing anyone. Just stop. Story 23. Not a scientist, but chemicals. No, Janet, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's good. Just because the drug is synthetic, it's not gonna kill you. Also, for fuck's sake, vaccinate your kids. This isn't even excusable at not being able to find information. Just go online and find a fuck ton of studies that show vaccines don't cause autism. Like, you can't even develop autism, so how the fuck do you think vaccines do that shit? Story 24. That both science and engineering are incremental processes. There are very few new inventions and breakthrough discoveries anymore, just the slow, steady progression of new insights and developments over old ones. Advances are made by huge teams of scientists, engineers, and supporting workers in corporations, government agencies, and non-profit foundations, not by lone geniuses working in their garages. And this is a good thing. This is what happens when you get billions of literate people, hundreds of millions of them with university degrees, and give them access to unprecedented communication and record-keeping technology. It's not about genius supermen anymore. Story 25. Not all bacteria are bad. We rely on many bacteria in order to stay alive. I used to volunteer at a science museum located in a more conservative state, where I would do interactive activities with children. As a microbiologist, I usually chose the activities that involved engineering bacteria to solve a problem. Most children would come up to me with the notion that all germs are bad, and their parents would be even more apprehensive, especially when I would explain that these methods are being used today. REs. Synthetic meats. That's not to say that there aren't bad bacteria, i.e., MRSA, but it's way too simple to say that all bacteria are bad, and it's kind of frustrating. Story 26. The future of space travel. So many people seem to think Star Trek-style warp drive is just around the corner, and it will soon be possible to visit other star systems. In reality, it is unlikely a human being will ever visit another star system. The distances and energy costs are just too great. What we are on the verge of being able to do is colonize the solar system, but so many people seem to think this isn't worth doing when we could just colonize Earth-like planets in other solar systems. This really pisses me off. Story 27. The whole antibiotic-free meat trend. Some animals in production are given antibiotics unnecessarily, and that's bad. But when companies boast about never giving antibiotics, you're eating sick animals. Any meat you eat does not contain antibiotics anyway. There is a set amount of time after giving medication where you can't slaughter the animal or collect eggs, milk for consumption. Also, cage-free is worse than having cages. The birds can't establish a pecking order because there's too many of them, and they just constantly fight in a very crowded arena. Story 28. That there isn't a clear answer to many questions. I'm working in a field which is quite relevant to many people, epidemiology, and my colleagues and I get lots of questions from people, be it personal friends or the media. Often the answer is, well, it depends. But people are so unhappy about that. And even if there is a causal association, they are usually not deterministic. People want easy answers. But things are complicated. Story 29. A good scientist will usually do their best to point out the weaknesses in their study or pet hypothesis. However, these rarely make it into articles because journalists find the endless caveats boring. But becoming a scientist is all about learning the many ways you can be wrong. And it teaches most of us humility. So if you hear somebody claiming that their new idea is revolutionary and overturns most current science, they are probably either exaggerating wildly or an utter crank. Story 30. Only looking for evidence that seemingly supports what you already believe does not make you informed, which kind of overlaps with my next point. Redditors. A lot of you have a terrible understanding of statistics, especially when it comes to studies that say something you don't want to hear, i.e., social science, or any time a study says something negative about pot. It makes me want to throw rocks at you guys sometimes. Story 31. If you count linguistics as a science, I wish people understood that non-standard dialects are just as well formed as standard X, standard English, French, Japanese, etc. Far too often people draw false conclusions about a person's education and capability because they speak a non-standard dialect. They'll even do it with accents. The ironic thing is, the people who draw these conclusions about non-standard dialect speakers are doing so out of ignorance. Story 32. As an immunologist, I wish people would realize that something posted on a quack's website, Facebook page isn't necessarily true, ethical, or scientifically valid. Peer-reviewed journals are the culmination of years of meticulous, well-performed research of which the results and methodology are constantly reviewed and replicated, yet these publications are somehow trusted less by non-scientists. Story 33. Stop blaming the developers for things you don't like in software. If something is really designed badly, it's always the fault of an analyst, project lead, or manager. Developers don't make those decisions. If a bug exists due to bad code, it means a developer made a mistake. That happens, and that none of the testing was able to discover it. That shouldn't happen. Story 34. I wish people better understood how narrow a field you work in if you are in research. No, Aunt Marge. The fact that I study cognition processes in the prefrontal cortex of the brain does not mean I know how to cure Uncle Dennis's Alzheimer's, nor am I interested in studying it. Story 35. Cancer. Cancer is just a subset of diseases. There will never be a cure for cancer. It's like calling a redwood tree a plant. I mean, it's correct, but there is so much more to it. There are treatments for certain types of cancer, but there will never be an end-all be-all cure for cancer. Story 36. The concept of evolution is wholly lost on the majority of the population. So many people seem to think that there is a roadmap to an endpoint. It's much more complex and stupider than that. For example, eyes have evolved many times, which is why there are different forms and structures of the eye. Story 37. Statistics. I'm a Psych PhD student, and every year without fail, some student will try to refute what I say by telling me a story about their best friend's cousin's estranged grandmother that is exactly the opposite of what I'm saying. So the whole science must be bunk. It's called an outlier. Story 38. Quantum just refers to quantized levels of energy. That means that energy comes in certain, discrete values, not in a range, x under 1, 2, 3, and 4, instead of 1.23232, 2.344, 3.455, 4.242. Yes, quantum mechanics is inherently probabilistic, but it's really not this exceptionally magical thing like superhero movies are making it out to be. Story 39. That being a scientist doesn't mean a person has knowledge of everything science-related. Contrary to what the media portrays, e.g., a particle physicist won't have better than intermediate understanding of biology. Heck, he will even struggle when it comes specialized knowledge in solid-state physics off of the top of his head. Story 40. Climate change and global warming doesn't mean that it's only getting hotter. It means that we have off-balanced our ecosystem, which causes more exaggerated weather events. We are expecting to have colder cold areas, hotter hot areas, drier dry areas, and wetter wet areas. Story 41. GEOs. If people understood genetics, there'd be much less debate on the topic. The public perception of a controversy among scientists over their safety is as false and unwarranted as for vaccinations. Story 42. Engineer here. Does that count? The importance of maintaining what you have. Innovation is great and all that, but maintenance is what keeps you safe, makes you profitable, and gives you the foundations for growth. Story 43. Basic understanding of mental disorders. It's still a surprise when people confuse schizophrenia with multiple personality disorder, especially with how common schizophrenia is compared to the few case studies that have been done on MPD.